Western philosophy originated as a fusion of proto-science and a neo-shamanic quest for wisdom or practical guidance. The idea was to learn how best to live based on understanding how the real world works. Western philosophy was likely influenced by Eastern schools of thought, such as Buddhism. The result was an elite intellectual counterculture that challenged folk religions and presumptions, a challenge that came to a head with the execution of Socrates. Christendom demonized paganism and replaced philosophy's independence and subversiveness with theological propaganda, but heretical streams of thought persisted, fueling the Italian Renaissance and what we think of as world-historic modern secularization, the rebirth of classical naturalism, and a sense of the epic heroism in our civilized struggles. After the scientific revolution, science split from both philosophy and religion, whereas in the ancient world, they were part of a neo-shamanic matrix. Modern philosophy has thus sought to distinguish itself from science and religion, and this hasn't been easy, especially in the late modern period in which reason seemed to undermine itself with cynicism, relativism, and nihilism. Let's take metaphysics as a case study. What does metaphysics add to theoretical physics and cosmology, on the one hand, and religious myth, theology, and faith-based creeds, on the other? The early modern view was that metaphysics is an a priori, transcendental science that can be done from the armchair as we investigate the broadest models with pure reason. This rationalist optimism fell by the wayside in the late modern period, as we lost trust in secular myths about reason, progress, and human nature. It was unsettling that many early modernists who pontificated about reason owned slaves or saw nothing wrong with that practice. Or these secular champions of human welfare thought men were generally superior to women. Outraged by the dubious secular myths that replaced Christian ones in the West, so-called postmodern thinkers thought we should deflate those myths and be more pragmatic about philosophy. Personally, I'm somewhere between modern optimism and late modern pessimism. In my view, for instance, metaphysics is a kind of rational analysis that reconciles scientific knowledge with the cultural sense of personhood's importance. An ontology is an overview that searches for the broadest vocabulary and principles that model, in effect, how people fit into the world, insofar as the world has been scientifically explained. What metaphysics adds to science and religion are checks on 1. Scientific objectification that leaves out the value of consciousness and civilized progress, and on 2. The arbitrariness, naivety, and repressive effects of religious myth-making and indoctrination. The metaphysical picture that works for me is naturalistic, meaning it accepts the authority of science on empirical questions of what's out there in the world. I shade my overview of nature, though, with an existential appreciation of absurdity, irony, and the implications of nature's counterintuitiveness. Nature isn't just a set of processes, elements, and forces that can be exploited with reason and ingenuity, although that's how it might seem from the standpoint of science's humanistic ethos. There's horror in nature's impersonal creativity, so my metaphysical story ends up being darkly pantheistic, like Arthur Schopenhauer's. The metaphysical question is about what basically exists, or what's most real. My answer is that, while science tells us the specifics, quantum fluctuations, black holes, space-time, and so on, the more general, philosophical answer is that reality is a wild plenum, an impersonal creative fullness bent on realizing all physical possibilities. The wildness of nature's productivity results in an unimaginably vast cosmic order, but one riven by discontinuities and absurdities. Stars and planets, for instance, clash grotesquely with black holes, and Newtonian or Einsteinian regularities conflict with quantum indeterminacy. Similarly, life clashes with non-life by delaying entropy and protecting negentropy. And civilized personhood aims to domesticate all traces of wildness. In short, there's a fundamental Promethean struggle in our corner of the cosmic wilderness, and this can be mythologized in religions, charted with scientific theories, or philosophically represented with conceptual analyses that bridge the myths and empirical models.
David, let me begin by acknowledging where we converge. We share the view that philosophy arose from an attempt to understand the real world and to guide life on the basis of that understanding. Philosophy is not an abstract detachment but a gesture of inscription that seeks to stabilize experience and give it meaning. However, I believe it is important to distinguish more precisely what is at stake. Ancient philosophy was not, in my view, a form of neo-shamanism. That reading risks spiritualizing a process that was first and foremost a rational effort, still limited by the cultural horizon of the time, but already distinct from myth. What marks the birth of philosophy is the passage from sacred narrative to critical argument, the attempt to think with rational categories what had previously been expressed in myth. In this sense, philosophy was from the beginning a technical gesture of thought, a symbolic reorganization that differentiated itself from religion even while coexisting with it. When Christianity took hold, it did not only demonize paganism, it also fought against rational thought, because reason is always dangerous for any dogmatic faith. Christianity could only survive by subordinating philosophy, integrating it into theological frameworks with Augustine or Aquinas. But at that point, we are no longer speaking of philosophy in the proper sense, but of argumentative theology. Philosophy that serves a revealed truth ceases to be the free exercise of reason and becomes a technique for legitimizing dogma. I also disagree with the idea that philosophy, science, and religion once belonged to the same field. Science was born from philosophy as its legitimate heir. It developed its own methods, but it inherited the demand for rationality. Religion, by contrast, was never born from philosophy, nor does philosophy derive from religion. One is founded on faith, the other on reason. They are incompatible in their foundations. The only overlap was the appropriation of philosophy by theology, which should never be confused with autonomous philosophy. This brings us to metaphysics, where our divergence is sharpest. From my point of view, philosophy does not need metaphysics, and science even less. Science relies on what is empirical and experimental. Philosophy relies on critical reason. Metaphysics, because it can be neither tested nor justified, is ultimately a matter of faith. For that reason, it belongs neither to science nor to philosophy, but to belief. Resorting to metaphysics seems to me a diversion, an attempt to fill with transcendent narratives what should instead be recognized as a limit. In essence, it is the refusal to accept the unfinished nature of reality. I do understand your intention when you define metaphysics as a way of reconciling science and culture, but I think that terminology creates more confusion than clarity. What you are describing, reflecting on the implications of scientific knowledge for the human condition, is not metaphysics but philosophy in its critical function. To call it metaphysics gives the impression of transcendence, when what is truly at stake is the interpretation of empirical results. If we wish to maintain conceptual clarity, we should recognize that philosophy itself is what mediates between science and culture, without any need to invoke a beyond physics. Finally, regarding your description of reality as a wild plenum marked by horror or darkness, I cannot follow you there. That nature is impersonal, on this we agree. But when you add attributes such as horror or monstrosity, I think you are once again projecting anthropocentric categories onto something that does not sustain such judgments. The cosmos is neither dark nor bright, it simply is. To dramatize reality with such adjectives obscures rather than clarifies our understanding. My own view is different. For me, reality is, quite simply, all matter in continuous reorganization. This reorganization is neither chaos nor teleology, but complexity, combinations, differentiations, and local stabilizations that give rise to persistent systems, from particles to galaxies, from atoms to living organisms. Out of this dynamic emerge life, consciousness, and thought. There is no need for a plenum or for attributing intentions or emotional tones to nature. Reality is matter in constant variation, and the human is only a local node of that complexity. It is from this conception that I developed the ontology of emerging complexity, a philosophy without metaphysics, without transcendence, without anthropocentric dramatizations, a philosophy that thinks reality as matter that inscribes itself, reorganizes itself, and creates new forms, always unfinished, always in variation.
Benjamin. When I referred to a neo-shamanic matrix, I meant to speak of a shamanic one. Shamans likely incorporated proto-scientific, philosophical, and religious tendencies since these facets of culture weren't yet professionally distinguished. Shamans had medical and therapeutic functions, and they searched for self-knowledge via psychedelic explorations and spun animistic myths to give meaning to tribal life. Pre-Socratic philosophers still largely combined those disciplines, but they did so in a neo-shamanic way because they indeed emphasized reason over myth-making. Platonism was essentially an intellectual gloss on the Eleusinian mysteries, which were neo-shamanic in producing the entheogenic experience with the Kaikion potion. Algis us Divinis shows how, in effect, Neoplatonism meditated on the theurgic practices of older religions. If philosophy was from the beginning a technical gesture of thought, why were early Western philosophers fixated on acquiring wisdom? What's so technical about wisdom? Sophists, rather, specialized in toying with baseless technicalities. The concept of ontology of emerging complexity, a philosophy without metaphysics, is oxymoronic, since ontology is just the subject matter of metaphysics. When you say that philosophy itself is what mediates between science and culture, without any need to invoke a beyond physics, that misses the fact that philosophy too is beyond physics or science. As I said, philosophy mediates between science and the more evaluative side of culture, including art and religion. Metaphysics is part of philosophy, and is just the search for the deepest, broadest vocabulary that makes sense of both science and values, and that thus supports a worldview that engages well with our existential condition. When you say that metaphysics, because it can be neither tested nor justified, is ultimately a matter of faith, that sounds like positivism. If what you mean to say is that metaphysics is too much like religion to be respectable because of its grandiose pronouncements, I'd agree, which is why I said we should deflate metaphysics by taking a pragmatic, largely postmodern view of it. So-called ontologies are just schemas for worldviews, and a worldview is a thinking mind's way of orienting itself to its environment. But if you're assuming a positivistic or scientistic demotion of philosophy and thus metaphysics, based on self-contradictory reverence for science, that would be problematic. If your ontology of emerging complexity isn't metaphysical, is it philosophical? If not, to what discipline does it belong? Obviously, it's metaphysical and thus philosophical. And I note the title of one of your online papers, The Impossibility of Western Philosophy to Liberate Itself from Metaphysics. That indicates that your ontology is either metaphysical with the rest of philosophy, or it's not philosophical because it's somehow not metaphysical, in which case it's probably positivistic and self-contradictory. Cosmicist Lovecraftian pantheism is the opposite of anthropocentric. The talk of nature's monstrous wildness is a value judgment, but it's an existential one, in that it follows straightforwardly from the upshot of scientific objectification. Nature is counterintuitive, and that's an objective, scientific fact. Now, nature doesn't care whether it makes sense to our intuitions, but we do. Hence, our most authentic worldviews must reckon with our alienation from nature. I agree that nature complexifies, but if your ontology is atheistic, as it should be if it's based on scientific knowledge and methods, then you should agree that nature's way of evolving and complexifying patterns is wild, meaning that it's uncivilized, amoral, and uncontrollable. The cosmos's inhuman enormity is also monstrous in defying our terrestrial expectations. When you imply that I attribute intentions or emotional tones to nature, that's a straw man. Nature's negative aesthetic value isn't an intention or emotion that nature feels, unless we speak circuitously about how, when we inevitably feel something, that's nature feeling through us. Still, these negative values are existential, not arbitrary, since they follow from the scientific picture that objectifies nature. Ironically, philosophy partially re-enchants what science disenchants. David.
Allow me to begin with a point that I consider decisive: the difference in how we use the term metaphysics. I use it in my strict etymological and historical sense, meta ta physica, that which lies beyond physics. In other words, metaphysics is the attempt to find ultimate foundations beyond experience and reason. In this sense, it is inseparable from a claim to transcendence, and that is why I reject it as a philosophical practice. In your reply, however, I see that you use metaphysics in a different sense, no longer as beyond physics, but as an effort to articulate science and culture through a broad vocabulary capable of orienting existence. This modern adaptation of the term is common in dictionaries and manuals, but it no longer preserves the root meaning of the concept. In that sense, what you call metaphysics is, for me, simply critical philosophy in full exercise, rational reflection on the meanings of science, culture, and life. Therefore, when I say that my philosophy is without metaphysics, there is no contradiction. What I reject is metaphysics in its etymological and classical sense, speculation beyond experience. What I practice is ontology, but understood as the analysis of reality as a complex material process, without recourse to transcendences. If we accept this distinction, you will see that I do not deny philosophy the right to think broadly. I merely refuse to call that work metaphysics. On this point, I would also like to underline a methodological issue. You referred to the title of one of my texts, The Impossibility of Western Philosophy to Liberate Itself from Metaphysics, as if it already confirmed your position. But that reference shows that you did not actually read the text in its entirety. Had you done so, you would have seen that the argument developed there is precisely the opposite, not an adherence to metaphysics but a critique of its structural persistence in the Western tradition. You would therefore have found some of the answers to the doubts you now raise. This is why I insist on the importance of attentive reading. Without it, we end up discussing only titles and impressions, not the actual arguments. As for the birth of philosophy, here too there is a difference in criteria. I agree that it emerges in a cultural context still marked by religious and shamanic practices, but I do not consider it appropriate to call the nascent philosophy neo-shamanism. In my view, philosophy begins only when thought becomes autonomous with respect to myth and faith, inaugurating a gesture of rational symbolic reorganization. This gesture may still be immersed in the cultural horizon of the time, but it is already something else: the passage from sacred narrative to critical argumentation. Before that, there is religion, right, ecstatic experience, but not philosophy. Our divergence, therefore, is not only about chronology, but about the very definition of what counts as philosophy. I consider that philosophy exists only from the moment reason is exercised as a symbolic technique of thought. Finally, regarding nature, I also notice a divergence. When you say that nature is counterintuitive, I see in this a biased and anthropocentric formulation. Intuition is human. It makes no sense to measure the cosmos by whether or not it conforms to our cognitive expectations. Science may show us that reality does not correspond to what we spontaneously expect of it, but that does not mean that nature is counterintuitive. It only means that the human has limits of perception and prediction. The same applies to adjectives such as horror, monstrosity, or wildness, that we may feel perplexity, strangeness, or even horror when faced with the impersonal dimension of the cosmos. On this, I do not disagree. But to say that nature itself is horrible or monstrous is another matter entirely. Science does not produce aesthetic values, it produces descriptions. Values are always human. To say that the cosmos is monstrous is therefore to attribute human categories to it, to project onto the universe what we feel when confronted with its impersonality. My own view is different. For me, reality is, quite simply, all matter in continuous reorganization. This reorganization is neither chaos nor teleology but complexity, combinations, differentiations, and local stabilizations that give rise to persistent systems, particles, stars, ecosystems, living organisms. Out of this dynamic emerge life, consciousness, and thought. There is no need to speak of horror or wildness. It is enough to recognize that reality is incessant variation and instability. The human is only a local node of that complexity, but a real one, capable of thinking and inscribing meaning. For this reason, I maintain, the philosophy I practice is a philosophy without metaphysics, a philosophy that does not dramatize nature or ascribe values to it but thinks it as matter in variation. A philosophy that recognizes there is no ultimate foundation, only continuous reorganization.
Benjamin. When you say then that your philosophy isn't metaphysical, I think that's a misleading way of saying that it's naturalistic, or that it's opposed to supernaturalism, speculations about transcendence, or that which might be literally beyond the physical. Even ancient metaphysics was based on reason and experience, and much of it was naturalistic. What made that philosophy metaphysical wasn't that it posited miracles, but that it conjectured in an intellectually responsible way rather than appealing strictly to myth, dogma, or priestly authority. Anyway, that's just a semantic question about labels. The question of whether something counts as neo-shamanic is also semantic. I'd agree that philosophy distinguishes itself by the use of reason in addressing very general questions about our presuppositions, but philosophy isn't generally hyper-rational or strictly objective. Not even science is purely objective, since scientific institutions are driven by a secular humanist ethos. You say, science does not produce aesthetic values, it produces descriptions. Values are always human. Sure, but science is human too. Again, I think there's some latent positivism in the dichotomy you posit between facts and values. I'd agree that science is as objective as anything could be, but scientific descriptions are models that inevitably simplify, so we shouldn't mistake the map for the territory. You quibble about my cosmicist labels. Counterintuitive, wild, monstrous. But I don't see you disagreeing with the underlying point. You want to say that philosophy should avoid such normative language, since this language speaks only to us, not to the facts of nature. But that's a scientific criterion, not a philosophical one, and we're supposed to be doing philosophy here. Again, that's positivism or scientism. I could just as easily say that philosophy that's purely descriptive and doesn't speak to the value of things doesn't address the human existential condition. The philosophical descriptions in question would then be in danger of being pseudo-scientific. I agree that science isn't in the business of dictating the value of things. But my point is that certain aesthetic values emerge straightforwardly from philosophical reflection on science. Those value judgments aren't strictly about the impersonal parts of nature. Instead, they're about the whole shebang that includes us. So they address people's existential condition, which is that people are embedded in an impersonal natural domain. I assume we agree that that's our basic condition, since our philosophies are both naturalistic, atheistic, scientifically informed, and so on. The disagreement seems to be about philosophy's role. Should philosophy be more like science than art? If philosophy is supposed to avoid value questions entirely, I don't see what philosophy adds to science. That's why positivism went nowhere, since it was self-contradictory. A philosophy that seems neutral can have unexamined evaluative presuppositions. When you say we should recognize that reality is incessant variation and instability, that sounds to me like just another way of saying that nature is the wild, monstrous, divine creator of all forms. The difference is that my language addresses what it feels like to be a person who recognizes our maker's impersonal nature. Yours summarizes scientific theories, but skips over the existential implications. Thus, you say, the human is only a local node of that complexity. But that word only has dire implications for our delusions of grandeur. Moreover, a node that thinks and attributes meaning isn't just a node. You're downplaying what would be the anomalousness of personal agency in a mostly impersonal universe. David.
1. Metaphysics, not a label, but a method which I reject. Our divergence is not semantic, but methodological. When I say that my philosophy is non-metaphysical, I am not merely signaling naturalism or anti-supernaturalism, I am rejecting a mode of proceeding. Operational definition I use. By metaphysics, I mean any attempt to ground the real through principles, entities, or totalizations that exceed the justifiable reach of experience and critical reason, even if the starting point is empirical. This includes appeals to a beyond, transcendence, ultimate foundation, totality as object, explanatory closures that admit no public rational control, not verifiable or defeasible by reasons or data. Universalizations that treat the whole as if it were an object to which one can legitimately and positively attribute properties. In this sense, the endpoint of metaphysics always lies outside reason. The conclusion that aims to close the system is not justifiable by the same criteria that govern the premises. It is a leap. Consequence: saying that my position is merely naturalist misses the point. My naturalism is accompanied by a methodological criterion, principle of immanence, do not postulate beyonds beyond the experienceable, arguable domain, ontological parsimony, do not multiply entities or foundations, criticizability, every thesis must be open to rational defeat. As for ancient naturalist metaphysics, even when not appealing to miracles, many classical constructions moved from experience to an ultimate foundation or necessity that was not justifiable by the same reasons that initiated the inquiry. It is precisely this transposition from the justifiable to the unjustifiable in principle that I refuse. Summary: metaphysics, which I reject. Exceeding the jurisdiction of critical reason experience in order to fix an ultimate foundation of the real. Critical ontology, which I practice. Describing and analyzing the architecture of the real in immanence, material processes, levels of organization, emergences, without converting epistemic limits into ontological foundations. Thus, it is not a matter of labels but of method. 2. Neo-shamanism and reason. It is true that science is a human practice, shaped by institutions and ethos. But that does not nullify its epistemic criterion, testability, revision, intersubjectivity. What distinguishes science from other discourses is not an impossible purity, but its permanent openness to controlled error. That is precisely what metaphysics lacks. It is not testable, it admits no procedures of verification or refutation. For this reason, even when it uses rationalizing language, it is not science. It approximates pseudoscience, in the sense of presenting itself as discourse about the real without the mechanisms of empirical control. Philosophy, in my view, must not be confused with science because its method is distinct. It does not test empirically but transduces. It integrates and critically reorganizes scientific knowledge while maintaining a rational foundation. It is not laboratory work but rigorous conceptual analysis. This is why I reject the expression hyper-rational. Rationality does not admit such gradations. Either a statement is rational, consistent, arguable, clear, or it is not. Granting philosophical status to mythical images is not a lower degree of rationality. It is leaving the field of the rationale altogether. What distinguishes philosophy from literature is precisely this normativity of reason. 3. Facts and values. Distinction of levels without positivism. There is no positivism here. The philosophy I defend does not avoid values. It integrates them, but at the level at which they emerge, the symbolic. The mistake is to confuse planes, projecting values, a symbolic category, as if they were properties of the cosmos, a physical descriptive category. Sketch of levels, physical non-symbolic, particles, forces, processes, biological functional, organisms, functions, adaptations, social symbolic, language, norms, institutions. Here values, ethical, political, aesthetic emerge. Values supervene on natural and intentional states, but they are not predicable of stars or galaxies. They are symbolic achievements within human practices, justifiable and revisable. Therefore, I do not eliminate values. I situate them. What I reject is the leap that transforms them into predicates of the universe. To say genocide is evil is a normative judgment justifiable by public reasons. To say a tsunami is evil makes sense only metaphorically, since there is no agent or responsibility involved. Thus, philosophy does not dissolve values into facts nor reify them as cosmic properties. It clarifies boundaries and legitimate crossings between description and evaluation. 4. The role of philosophy, neither science nor art. Here I see the central misunderstanding in your conception, placing philosophy between science, with its objectivity and empirical method, and art, with its subjectivity and narratives. This is a false alternative, as if philosophy could only be understood by opposition. Philosophy is neither pseudo-science nor pseudo-art. It is its own domain, the exercise of critical reason in autonomy. It is not science, it does not produce laws or empirical models. It is not art, it does not invent narratives or fictions. It is philosophy. It produces operational concepts, clarifies planes, reorganizes symbols, opens new intelligibilities. It dialogues with science, interrogating assumptions and consequences without trying to replace it. It dialogues with art and culture, reflecting on symbolic forms without confusing itself with them. Philosophy's role is to clarify limits and reorganize the symbolic. That is its specific universe. 5. Instability, agency, and anthropocentrism. What I call variation and incessant instability is not equivalent to wild or monstrous. The first is descriptive and neutral, proper to matter. The second is symbolic, evaluative, human. Confusing the two planes is a serious error. Regarding human agency, I do not minimize it. On the contrary, I inscribe it as a highly differentiated expression of matter, emerging in biological and symbolic contexts. The human is not an ontological exception, but neither is it irrelevant. It is a local node capable of symbolically reinscribing reality. The difference between us seems to be this. You see agency as an anomaly in an impersonal universe. I see it as a differentiated continuity of matter, not an inexplicable rupture. Your concern with the word only in local node reveals, in my view, a residual anthropocentrism. Of course, it is hard for human pride to accept that we are not the center of the cosmos, but rational rigor compels us to do so. Recognizing our condition does not diminish agency, it situates it where reality allows, a powerful but contingent phenomenon within a vast complexity that does not depend on us, and humanity has already endured a similar blow once, when it abandoned geocentrism for heliocentrism. To accept that Earth was not the center of the universe was a rude shock to human pride. The same is happening now at the ontological level. To accept that our symbolic agency is not a cosmic exception, but a differentiated continuity of matter, requires philosophical courage. Yet it is precisely that step which distances us from illusion and brings us closer to the real.